Hi friends, so I talk a lot about Western imperialism and colonization, etc., but I haven't spent a lot of time speaking in particular about Australia and our colonization of Indigenous people here and what that has turned into over the centuries. And Jerry Gouropoulos, who I've interviewed, I interviewed him about a year and a half ago when I was able to do live streams when my connectivity was better. I interviewed him about Indigenous issues in Australia and Indigenous suicide and that kind of thing. And it's a good interview, except that it's the audio on Jerry's side is not very good, unfortunately. But anyway, Jerry has posted something about the Australia's entering second convict age as imprisonment rates soar. And of course, you can guess who's the highest percentage of the peoples imprisoned, and it happens to be Indigenous people. Anyway, I'm going to read some of this, and I think this sort of is similar. You know, it's similar to what is happening in the United States, where there's structural racism, and it's the same here in Australia. So Indigenous Australians are now more likely to be in prison than African Americans, according to new research by Labor parliamentarian and economist Andrew Leigh, warning that Australia has entered a, quote, second convict age. Lee's new working paper finds that in 2018, around 43,000 Australians were in prison, a rate of 220 for every 100,000 adults, which he says is a significant jump since incarceration rates began climbing in 1985. And just to note, you know, the private prison system has come into Australia, and that's sort of what's happened in the United States, where private prisons are making literally a killing by mass incarceration of a lot of black people and so forth. Analyzing statistics since mid-1980s, Leigh says by 1990, the imprisonment rate was 114 prisoners per 100,000 adults. By 2000, it was 152 prisoners per 100,000 adults, and by 2010, it was 175 per 100,000 adults, and by 2018, it was 221 per 100,000. Quote, in proportionate terms, the rise in incarceration rates from 1985 to 2018 amounts to a 130% increase, end quote. The working paper says, quote, not since 1899 has Australia incarcerated such a large share of the adult population, end quote. For Indigenous Australians, the incarceration trends are even more worrying. The research shows that over the past 3 decades, the share of Indigenous adults in prison has more than doubled from 1,124 per 100,000 adults in 1990 to 2,481 per 100,000 adults in 2018. Quote, Indigenous Australians are more likely to be in jail than African Americans, end quote, the working paper says. Leigh says in 2007, the African American incarceration rate was 75% higher than the Indigenous incarceration rate, but in 2017, the Indigenous incarceration rate for the first time exceeded the African American incarceration rate. He says more Indigenous men born in in the 1970s, almost 1 in 4 have spent time in prison, and 9/10 of Indigenous men from Western Australia born in the late 1980s have been arrested, charged, or summoned by police. The research says it is possible that for some cohorts of Indigenous men, such as those without formal education qualifications living in Western Australia and the Northern Territory, quote, the lifetime incarceration risks exceed 50%, end quote. Incarceration rates in Australia are comparable to New Zealand, but higher than in Canada or England and Wales. Quote, while the rates are lower than in the United States, the nation has seen a decline in imprisonment since 2007, while Australia has witnessed a marked increase over the same period, end quote. Leigh says up until 1970 there was a strong correlation between homicide and imprisonment in Australia, but now imprisonment has risen in spite of falling crime rates. He finds that from 1970 homicide rates and incarceration rates diverge. Homicide rates rose through the 1970s while incarceration rates fell, but since the mid-1980s homicide rates have halved while the incarceration rate has doubled. He says he says prison populations are also changing. Between 1985 and 2018, the share of women prisoners nearly doubled, the share of Indigenous prisoners nearly tripled, and the average age of prisoners increased by 7 years, from 29 years old to 36 years old. Quote, together, these gender, race, and age trends imply that young white men comprise a smaller share of prisoners today than they did a generation ago, Leigh says. The working paper says it is, quote, probable, end quote, that the higher reporting rates, stricter policing practices, tougher sentencing laws and more stringent bail laws are the main drivers of Australia's growing prison population. The trend is negative in both economic and societal terms because a period of imprisonment reduces people's employment prospects and is negative for their general health and well-being. Released prisoners have a high chance of being homeless, Leigh says, and many reoffend. Quote, the rise in Australian incarceration rates over the past generation is a policy choice, not an accident, end quote, Leigh says. While rates for most crimes have fallen, governments have deliberately chosen policies that have toughened bail laws and increased the amount of time that the typical prisoner serves. Quote, mass incarceration has reached the point at which its costs undoubtedly outweigh its benefits, end quote. Leigh says, quote, more rational criminal justice policies would have saved taxpayers money, improved community safety, and avoid the scarring effect of prison on offenders and their families, end quote. Quote, better policies would avert a second convict age and produce a society with less crime and less punishment, end quote. So that was by Catherine Murphy, a political editor for The Guardian, and it's titled Australia's Entering, quote, second convict age, end quote, as imprisonment rates soar. So, I mean, it's interesting, of course, that this all correlates with neoliberalism kicking in Australia. After Gough Whitlam was ousted, he was a Democratic Socialist Prime Minister, and with the help of the CIA, who admitted it, he was gotten rid of, and ever since then it's been a downhill slide of neoliberalism. So that, of course, has a lot to answer for. And on top of that, obviously, there's the, well, not so obviously to some people, but obviously, you know, the capitalism, which is at its end stage now, that doesn't really benefit anybody except the oligarchs. There is no trickle-down effect, and that makes for an employer's paradise. And if you're an Indigenous person, you're much less likely to be employed. I mean, it's all still there, you know, and even trying to rent, that's also difficult. If they have a choice between a white person and an Indigenous person, they're probably going to go with the white person, even if the Indigenous person is much more suitable. It's just sort of how it is. It's terrible. And also, you know, just the way Western capitalism has destroyed the land, which is always valued by Indigenous peoples, and they get Indigenous people out of the way because their whole way of life, traditional way of life, is anti-capitalist. You don't want anti-capitalists interfering with your destroying the earth and sort of profiting off destruction. So, you know, that's how it is. It's a dreadful thing, and this right-wing government is particularly ruthless. The major party, the Labor Party, the Australian Labor Party, is not much better, but this current government, the Scott Morrison government, is sort of appalling. They're appalling to different races, to Muslims, to LGBT people, and so forth. Everything that you would expect from a neoconservative, right-wing, bigoted government. Anyway, and I saw something from Jerry Garopoulos. Oh, sorry, I'm pronouncing his name wrong. I always have a problem with his last name. Georgatis, sorry, Jerry Georgatis. He posted something yesterday, which I thought was interesting, and I'll just read it to you. And he said, I do not indulge, I live. The majority of Australians are racist, and this is profoundly understood and indisputably validated by my experientialism, by lived experience. I am older than 2/3 of Australians, have travelled to more than 600 destinations Australia-wide, mixed it with tens of thousands through my 4 decades of working life, and closely supported and interacted with thousands of Australians. So-called experts and pontificating commentators can write books and working papers, opinion pieces and akin, but nothing can reduce the ugly racism, the exclusion I experienced as a child in the 1960s, or the racism and classism I experienced as a teenager in the 1970s. There was a period of some hope that racism would be checked and some progress made, and though much will change positively with assimilation forefront for certain culturally diverse peoples in the half-century ahead, the Saxony, more so than xenophobia, will become as ugly again and worse for future migrants who hoped Australia as home. With missionary fervour, there remains a predominantly Anglo-centric white supremacism in Australia, dominating our media and parliaments and the nation's boardrooms and the bastions of power such as the civil service that manages Canberra, that will never surrender to equality. They will allow for the assimilated and for managed token appearances. The vanquishing of racism per se rests in the century and a half ahead, with peoples from throughout Asia becoming the majority Australians and extinguishing Anglo-centric racisms. My experience, my personal witness, is more profound than writings and akin. For a wog like me, with a high IQ, I'm the least of who a perennially threatened oppressive peddler wants around. The nation's worst self, piled with racism and classism, is found in our political leadership, in our governments, and so we have to cope. Anyway, it kind of makes me sad reading that from Jerry Deodatis, because he's been around Australia a lot. He's met a lot of people, he's been involved with government and he's done a lot for Indigenous people, so he'd have a fairly good idea, and I totally agree with him. The only way for this to really change is when white people in Australia become a minority group, and that's what a lot of white people are pushing against and kicking against so hard, is because really white people, we don't want to be treated the way we have treated other races and other minority groups. And we think that that's what's going to happen when we become a minority. We're projecting our own unfortunate behaviours on other groups. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say. Please subscribe if you haven't already to this channel. Please click the like button if you like the content, and please click the notifications bell, otherwise you won't receive any updates when I post them. And thank you so much for watching. My name's Trish Roberts. You're watching Faint Signals from Riga. Till next time. Bye for now.